Some singers leave you nodding in appreciation and move on. David Phelps leaves you with something harder to name, a stillness that settles somewhere behind the sternum and doesn't lift for days. 30 years of gospel music ministry will do that to a voice, or rather, a voice like his will do that to 30 years of gospel music. And now, at 55, the man who quietly rewired what audiences expected from Christian music is saying something his listeners are still learning to sit with. He's saying it calmly, without grief, without grievance, and with the kind of settled certainty that belongs to someone who made peace with a decision long before the conversation ever became public. Born in 1970 in Tomball, Texas, David came to music the way certain people come to faith, not by choosing it so much as by being unable to avoid it. Formal vocal training at Baylor University in the early 1990s sharpened what was already there, and by his mid-20s the development was impossible to miss. His tenor voice, that upper register capable of splitting a room clean open, was not manufactured by training so much as uncovered through it, layer by layer, through years of discipline and Christian faith. And when Bill Gaither made the phone call in 1994, David said yes. And what followed rewrote what the Gaither Vocal Band was capable of producing for an entire generation of Christian music listeners. The homecoming recordings of the 1990s and early 2000s became something none of them had planned for, a soundtrack for American Christian worship that traveled into living rooms, church basements, and long Sunday drives across the country. Standing alongside Bill Gaither, Guy Penrod, and Mark Lowry, David held his own on those gospel music stages, and on the right nights, he did something even rarer. He made the veterans turn and look. Jerusalem became one of those moments. That note held at the top of his tenor range with a purity that made grown men bow their heads without meaning to, traveled through those recordings into the bones of an entire generation of gospel music listeners. Audiences who had grown up watching those homecoming tapes didn't just admire David Phelps. They built their understanding of what Christian worship could sound like around what his voice was capable of doing. And nobody watching at the time understood how much those performances were quietly costing him. His first departure from the Gaither Vocal Band came in 2004, and the reasons he offered were honest as far as they went. A solo ministry built on his own terms, a young family that deserved more of his presence, an artistic vision the group format could only partially contain. All of that was real, and David returned in 2007, and for a while, something felt whole again. But touring at that level extracts payment from places that never show up on a calendar. And across those years, he and his wife Lori were raising their children, while David spent night after night giving audiences everything a tenor voice can give. The arithmetic of that life eventually produced a number that was simply impossible to ignore. David has spoken about this with a directness his audience has always recognized as genuine. No blame aimed at the Gaither organization, no grievance about the road itself, just a clear-eyed account of what those years cost alongside what they produced. His daughter Maggie has grown into a performer of her own, carrying her father's voice forward in a way that has genuinely stunned audiences who assumed that particular gift belonged to one generation only. When David speaks about his children, about the life he and Lori have built across 3 decades of marriage and Christian ministry, that isn't background detail. That life is the center of every decision that looks surprising from the outside. The thing he consistently points back to when the choices need explaining. And then there is the layer that most coverage of David Phelps has never quite named directly. A voice is a physical instrument. and every physical instrument carries a lifespan. Every singer who operates at David's level, reaching those notes and sustaining that intensity night after night across 30 years of gospel music, carries a quiet understanding of what that costs physically. At 55, David has been open about the discipline required to protect what remains, about what his voice can and cannot do now compared to what it could produce at 30. For anyone listening carefully to his recent conversations, a pattern becomes clear. The more selective appearances, the solo concerts built around genuine connection rather than vocal spectacle, the way he frames his current work. All of it points toward stewardship rather than surrender. He is managing something irreplaceable with honesty, being truthful with himself and with the people who have followed his tenor voice for decades about what that honesty genuinely requires of him. Calling any of this decline would miss the point and get the story wrong entirely. David Phelps, at 55, still produces moments that stop people cold, and the artistry behind those moments has only deepened across the years. What has shifted is the calculation around how he deploys that gift, and whether the structure of a touring vocal group with its fixed calendar and collective demands still fits the kind of careful protection his voice now needs. The answer he arrived at gradually, and without visible bitterness, is that it doesn't. And once that answer settled fully inside him, it was not going to be walked back for any reason. What his audience didn't expect was that his most direct statements about calling would arrive not through some dramatic announcement, but across a series of quiet conversations, each one more settled than the last. He has spoken about wanting his concerts to feel like real exchanges with the people in the room, about wanting the faith dimension of his work to sit in the foreground rather than behind the spectacle of what his voice can technically accomplish. The difference between being a world-class tenor inside a world-class ensemble and being a minister who happens to carry a world-class voice. That distinction matters deeply to the people who know him. Lori has described what she calls the second chapter of David's ministry. Not a lesser chapter, but a different one, built around the life they chose deliberately, rather than the life the road had been quietly choosing for them year by year. David Phelps is not the first extraordinary voice to leave the Gaither circle without returning on any permanent basis. Michael English, whose recordings with the group in the late 1980s and early 1990s produced some of the most celebrated moments in the entire Homecoming catalog, moved toward an independent ministry that suited a different season of life and calling. Russ Taff, a voice of almost frightening emotional depth, worked largely outside the formal Gaither Vocal Band structure for most of the past 2 decades, and his appearances within the broader Homecoming community remained deeply treasured even so. What these departures share is not conflict or rupture, but recognition. The recognition that a certain calling requires a certain freedom, and that the framework serving an artist at one stage of a career doesn't always serve him at the next one. Bill Gaither has understood this better than almost anyone working in gospel music. Across conversations and public statements over the years, he has made clear that what he has always wanted for the artists in his orbit is genuine flourishing, not a performance of loyalty. The Homecoming recordings were never designed to preserve these voices in amber. They were celebrations of what was alive in particular people at particular moments. And when those people move into new seasons, the celebration moves with them into whatever comes next. David and Bill have maintained a relationship built on real affection and mutual respect that survives the distance between them, and no estrangement lives anywhere in this story. Only an honest acknowledgement of what passed between them and what has begun since. What comes next for David Phelps is something his audience will follow with the same attention they gave the past 30 years. He is not stepping away from music or from Christian ministry. He is doing what the most self-aware artists eventually do when faith and honesty are both pointing in the same direction. Following the specific thread of his calling wherever it leads, protecting the instrument that makes that possible, and refusing to let nostalgia make decisions that belong to clarity alone. Maggie has already shown that the gift passes down. Lori has shown what it looks like to build a life alongside someone whose voice belongs in some fundamental way to far more people than just you, and to do that with grace across 30 years. And David himself has shown the gospel music community something they may not have expected from the young tenor who held that impossibly high note on a homecoming stage back in 1994. He has shown them what it looks like to grow up in public, to let a calling evolve without apology, and to carry that evolution forward with honesty fully intact. The most important music David Phelps will ever make may still lie ahead, not the music of a homecoming stage, but something quieter and more deliberate, something fitted to the chapter he and Lori are living right now, and the people who have followed this ministry for 30 years or more already know that, without needing to be told.